If you've ever thought you couldn't tutor the SAT because you're not a math whiz or your vocabulary isn't huge, let me just tell you, that is not true. I've tutored the SAT for over 20 years, and I'm a math teacher as well as a writing teacher on top of that. But in all that time, I've learned two things about this test that I've never heard anyone else talk about. And once you know them, tutoring the SAT gets so much easier for you and for your students. I'm Daisy Luce. I help people build a flexible, profitable online tutoring business, the same kind I built for myself by specializing in a high demand niche. The SAT is one of those amazing tutoring niches, and that's what I want to dig into today with you. Okay, secret number one. All the math on the SAT can be done using just what you learned in Algebra 1 and geometry, and sometimes even middle school. Not Algebra 2, not pre-calc, definitely not calculus. None of the scary stuff you maybe haven't seen since high school if you're not a math teacher. If you know the basics, though, you remember just the basics from Algebra 1 and geometry, you have everything you need to solve every single math problem on the SAT. I know that sounds too good to be true because almost everything you'll read online says SAT math goes up through Algebra 2, and some websites even say you have to have had pre-calc to do the SAT. I'm telling you, you don't. That's not true. And I say that again as a math teacher who has worked through every kind of problem on the SAT. Now, sometimes I have seen students use their higher math knowledge to solve a problem on the SAT, and it works. But usually, what I see is that the SAT will try to make problems look very complicated, and they will even at times make a problem look like something from, let's say, pre-calc class. But here's what happens. If a student tries to solve that problem with their higher level math knowledge, it takes them way longer than a much easier and simpler method they may have learned in Algebra 1 or geometry. It's shocking how many times I see this. Just as a quick example, maybe I've seen a problem that looks almost like a trig identity from pre-calc class. So say the student runs into this and they immediately start thinking about all of the trig identity formulas that they learned back in that class. But they notice they can't find a formula that matches with the question exactly, and they get stuck. And then they can't solve it. And they think it's because they've forgotten something and they give up. Meanwhile, the actual way to solve the problem and the easiest is to use a skill you learned back in geometry, like just type it into your calculator to solve. It sounds too easy to be true, but I see this over and over again to the point that one of the mantras I have when I tutor a student is to remind them to think like a freshman in math class, not like a senior. Meaning, you've got to remind yourself to go back to the basics over and over again. Don't overcomplicate what you're looking at on this test. Don't overprocess. Don't overthink it. Now, one honest caveat I do want to say, depending on where you live, what state you're in, your schools might actually not teach some of the material that you need until Algebra 2 or pre-calc. Maybe it's not covered in Algebra 1 or geometry. That is a possibility, but I personally live in a state that isn't known for winning any academic awards, or not many, and I say that with all the love because I love my state. But even with that said, my state does cover everything on the SAT in Algebra 1 and geometry and middle school. Don't forget about middle school. It's sometimes shocking how the SAT writers can bring back the most basic concepts from middle school and twist them into wild questions. But the skill they are testing is still a middle school skill. That was a little bit of a tongue twister. Is still a middle school skill. So if my state is doing it, I'm pretty sure most of your states are doing it too. And I'm going to hold to that, that the SAT can be solved with everything you've learned through Algebra 1 and geometry and back in middle school, and not only can be solved, but should be solved most of the time with the way you learned something back then. And if you still don't believe me, which I'm sure a lot of you out there might not, because I know what I'm saying goes against the norm, but if you still don't believe me, then I will continue this series for the next few weeks so I can show you real problems that demonstrate exactly what I'm talking about so you can see it. You don't have to be a math genius to be an SAT tutor or to do well on the SAT as a student. And that usually is very encouraging to not only tutors, but to the students you're going to be teaching too. I always share that with them and open it up with that so they can start to wrap their minds around the fact that they can do the problems on this test. But let's talk about, why is the math that simple? What are they doing? Why are they making a test like that? And that brings us to the second secret about the SAT, and it's a big one too. The SAT is not a knowledge test at all. It's what I like to call a logic test. This isn't a theory that I've just come up with, though. It is how the test was built. So the SAT is almost 100 years old. In fact, I think I just read this today. It's 100 this month, I believe. We're in June of 26 right now. And yeah, I think it's supposed to be 100 years old this month. So, wow, what a great time to do a month-long series on the SAT. But to give you a little background, the test itself began as a test that the Army used uh, in World War I, and it was built to measure how a person thinks, not what they memorized in school. So we're basically talking about an aptitude test, or what many people would commonly know as an IQ test. There was a Princeton professor named Carl Brigham who turned those into the first SAT in 1926, those type questions. And they even called it the SAT, which stood for, at the time, the Scholastic Aptitude Test. Again, aptitude like IQ, trying to test the innate intelligence that you were born with rather than what you've learned in a classroom. That's important to note, okay? So if you missed that, let me say it one more time. An aptitude or an IQ test, which is how the SAT was first developed, was trying to test your innate intelligence that you were born with rather than what you learned in school. So the test, in order to do that, had to ask questions that were not covering higher material from classroom knowledge, but more logic-based typed questions that anyone was supposed to be able to answer. Okay, years later, not that long ago in our past, in 1993, the SAT quietly dropped the word aptitude, but they still wanted to be called SAT. So now they changed it to assessment. So that switched from scholastic aptitude test to I can't say that, scholastic assessment test. They took it right out of the name, and there's a reason. Aptitude made it sound like the test measured fixed intelligence, the kind you're born with. If that were true, though, tutors would be non-existent and wouldn't be important. There'd be nothing to teach. If you could truly make a test that measured your fixed intelligence, which there's a lot of discussion and arguments if that's even possible, then we wouldn't need tutoring, because you wouldn't be able to tutor someone and help them get a better score on the SAT. But they say they're not trying to measure intelligence any longer, and I think that's true. But I don't think they're trying to measure knowledge either, classroom knowledge. What it is trying to measure is your reasoning ability, and reasoning is just patterns, not necessarily deep knowledge, and a student can learn those patterns and you can teach those patterns. A lot of things, a lot of problems on the SAT are pattern recognition. And if you have a chance to see these problems and understand them and understand the pattern involved and the reasoning, you can recreate the correct answer on other questions that are similar. So even though the test is not necessarily an aptitude or what we would call an IQ test, it is still not a true knowledge-based test either, and that's why I like to call it a logic test. That's also why the math stays simple on the SAT. A test built to measure reasoning can't depend on whether a kid took pre-calc or not. It has to level the playing field, as we were talking about. So the hard-looking material is almost never the point. When a question looks complicated, that is usually a trap. And it doesn't stop at the math, though. That's the really interesting part. The same logic that runs through the math runs through the reading section too. Now, you might think, how is reading going to turn into a logic section? Because usually math and logic go more hand in hand. But I'm telling you, and I'm going to show you in this series, how the grammar questions, the vocabulary, the transition words, all of it uh, um, it also is built on logic type abilities. By the end of this series, you'll watch me get a very, very hard vocabulary question right without even knowing what the word means. So why do these two secrets matter so much for you? Because, and probably obvious, once you know them, you stop teaching the test the hard way. You're not reteaching years of algebra. You're not having to relearn years of algebra. You're not drilling endless grammar rules or handing out long vocabulary lists for your students to memorize. You're teaching a handful of patterns and the confidence to trust them. And that's less work for you, less work for your students. It's also the reason almost anyone with strong academic skills can teach the SAT really well, even if you haven't touched some of this material in years. You don't have to be the expert who knows everything. You just have to be the guide who knows the logic. And I can show you that too as well. So over the next few weeks, I'm going to dive into specifics so you can see how to approach different problems with this newfound logic knowledge. We'll start with the math because yes, that is my favorite, although I'm a huge fan of grammar too. Math is one of those where those two ideas come together really most clearly. So that's where I want to start with. Then we'll move on to reading, grammar, vocabulary, like I said, all the other good stuff, all kinds of reading problems, and I'll show you the logic running through every part of it. So there they are, two secrets about the SAT that you really are not going to hear very, very many other places. And I'm sure many tutors would try to argue these ideas or disagree, and that's fine. Every tutor has to figure out their path and how they want to go about approaching this test. But I'm telling you, from after teaching this test for 20 years and understanding the history of the test, this is what it's about. Number one, as I said, the math is just Algebra 1 and geometry. And number two, the whole test is a logic test, not a knowledge test. So I want you to keep those two ideas in your back pocket, and you're already ahead of the game. If you want a head start though, you want my free SAT math formula sheet, you can find the link below to click on that. It is every single math formula you need to know for the SAT. And I bet if you click on it and check it out, I bet you'll be really pleasantly surprised with how many of those formulas you already know. Hit subscribe, follow me here if this clicked for you. If you want to catch up the rest of this month about SAT and see more about the logic behind the test, follow me here. Until next week, happy tutoring, friend.